Hello, Spiritual Formation Book Club. I'm Aaron, and at the beginning of every year, there's no better way to start than to look back at what you've done the previous year and see how you've grown, seen what you've read, seen where you were in January of 2023, and how you've progressed to 2024. So that's what I'm doing today with these books. I've got 6 books that I've loved and 6 books that well, I wouldn't say despised, but that I probably wouldn't read again. Now, there are some caveats in that list, so be sure to check all of them. These are not books that I absolutely hate, but books that were either not right for me at the time, that I might have to check out again in the future, or, in some cases, ones that I'll probably never touch again. But before we get to those 6 books, I have actually 2 honorable mentions, 2 books that aren't on this list for various reasons. The first one is Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. Now, this is not on the list yet because while this would have been my favorite book of 2023, I still have about 300 pages left. It's gotten to the point where after 1,000 pages, I don't want it to end. I think that this is a book that I read voraciously for probably about 2 or 3 months, and then over the last 7-8 months, I've slowly read just a couple chapters at a time, put it away, pulled it back out a week or 2 later, read a little more. War and Peace is a book that I don't want to end. This is likely going to go down as my favorite book of all time, and I'm sad that there's only 300 pages left. Now, the good news is that as soon as I finish it, I will be reading this book endlessly. I will go directly from the end back to the beginning and start it over. Within the pages of this book, entire lives, entire stories, entire cultures and subcultures. And we follow these characters throughout this story in ways that I would have never even ventured. My favorite characters in War and Peace are a toss-up between the lovely Natasha and the ever-growing, ever-molding Pierre. I see parts of myself in both of those characters in ways that I would have never even imagined possible. If you've not given this book a chance, then I would highly recommend it, because I can almost guarantee that after I finish it, it'll end up on my top list of 2024. The next book that is not actually on this list is a first for me. It is Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. Throughout this year, I've read a number of books focused around the French Revolution, either right before, during, or right after. And A Tale of Two Cities does a better job than I thought possible at explaining the horrors of what the French Revolution and the time of terror really put into the hearts and minds of its citizens and those who ventured into the territories of France. Now, this is not on my list for a couple reasons. One, because it is simultaneously a book that I love and a book that I hated. A Tale of Two Cities is split into 3 sections. And the first section I found to be okay. I enjoyed it. It was typical Charles Dickens. You're introduced to a lot of characters right off the start, and I'm just sort of trying to put all of names and faces together in my mind, trying to figure out who's who and how they're related, what's going on. And then the second section hits. And I find the second section, which is called A Golden Thread, to be extremely important to understand what happens in the third section, but also just it dragged for me. It took so long for me to get through that section that I didn't know if I would actually finish the book. But then when that third section hits and you are in revolutionary France and the Republic is going full swing and heads are falling left and right, there is nothing like it. I have never encountered a book that has given me a true understanding of what humanity is capable of. Now let's get into the 6 books that I read this year that were not for me at this time. The first is The Nine Tailors by Dorothy Sayers. Now, I've never read a book by Dorothy Sayers before, and it was given to me as almost a Sherlock Holmes type. You have the main character, Lord Peter Wimsey, who solves these mysteries throughout the book. And the mystery itself is fine. It's fun, it's entertaining. It involves church bells, which is an inventive and fun way of taking the church and what can happen within it and examining the lives of those who intermingle within a small town. When this dead body shows up and nobody knows who it is, nobody's gone missing, and Lord Peter Wimsey sort of goes through and figures out what has happened. Now, why this book was not for me is because I could not stand Dorothy Sayers' writing style. Her prose is not for me. I want to check out other books of hers. So if you have a recommendation of one of these books or any book by Dorothy L. Sayers that I should check out besides this one, let me know in the comments below, because I want to give her another try. But the prose in this book did one of the things that bothers me the most, which is having action within dialogue. Now, it's a common thing to happen, but the way that she portrays action within dialogue really grinded my gears. She would have a character talking as though something is happening, but not really explain what it is. Something along the lines of, "Oh, hi, how are you? Yes, I will take a cup of tea. No, I don't really want that. Hey, what's that behind the door?" And you sort of go through the progression of this meeting without ever really seeing the meeting. You just hear one side of it. That is not the kind of prose, the kind of writing style, the kind of dialogue that I enjoy. But I know a lot of people love Dorothy L. Sayers. So again, if you have a different recommendation for me, put a recommendation below and I'll check it out. Number 2 in my 6 books that were not for me this year was Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. Now, at first, I really enjoyed this book. It took me a long time to get through. It was the first time that I had read Fyodor Dostoevsky, and I have since continued to read him and plan to read everything that he's written, because I have found that he influences me on almost a metaphysical level, a spiritual level. This book did it. I enjoyed the narrative of this book, but it was extremely difficult to get through, as I am in the mind of Raskolnikov and seeing his progression into almost a sort of madness as he commits this crime and is trying to figure out whether or not he's going to get caught. In the end, he ends up turning himself in because he was not what he would consider a great man. He was testing this theory that he could be like Napoleon or be like these other people who can commit murder and not commit murder for a greater good and not have it weigh on their conscience. But this is an entire book of a weighty conscience and what sin, a prevalent sin, can do to the soul when left unchecked. Now, why is this on my list? It's because of another book of Dostoevsky's that I read right after this that's going to be on my top 5. I had read that Crime and Punishment in this other book, you either love one and hate the other, or just one of them resonates with you more. And for me, the other one resonates on an entirely different level. My third book is George MacDonald's Fantasy Collection. Now, George MacDonald was a pastor who wrote in order to try and get his congregation to understand some of the ideals and some of the theology that he was trying to portray. Now, his writing style, again, was not for me. I read Lilith, The Princess and the Goblin is in here, The Light Princess, and Phantastes. Not a single one of these 4 stories captured me, entertained me, would I even go back to ever read these again? Now, a lot of people enjoy George MacDonald, and he's somebody who influenced people like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. But I think we've progressed beyond his form of fantasy, which is why he's not really talked about in the collective anymore. He's not talked about as a major influence on people today, because he is the influence on the people who influence us today. If you're interested in fantasy, then it might be worth checking out, but I gave him a shot. I'm done with him. Number 4 on this list of top 6 books not for me this year was a two-parter. It is The Nicene Faith, parts 1 and 2. Now, my problem with these books is that from the get-go, I had my seminary professor tell the class that these are 2 books that he read right after he graduated with his PhD, and it was like he had not even received a PhD. He had no idea what was going on in these books, which is not something you want to hear from your professor when he gives you a book to read. What these books do, this is the formation of Christian theology, the Nicene Faith. It walks through our understanding of the Trinity and how we progress over the first 400 years to understanding the Trinity within the Catholic Church, or within the Church at large. It takes a look at the early Church Fathers, the different arguments, all the way up to Augustine and the Council of Nicene, and all the things that progressed from the time of Jesus until that council. I enjoyed these books. But there are probably, if I had to guess, there are probably 10,000 different names in this book. The author, John Behr, will name drop somebody on page 3 and expect that you remember who he was talking about and what that person did, what their theology was, 100 pages later, after you've read the names and theology of 50,000 other people. These are books that I want to read again, but I almost need to take an entire year to get through. I need to take them slowly, maybe even create a flowchart of the different people and who they influenced, how they were influenced, what their thoughts were. So these are extremely formative books. I just didn't get the formation from them because I had to read them so quickly for school. But I do look forward to going back to them in the future. Book number 5 was one of the worst books that I think I have ever read. This is from a popular author in the Christian sphere named Shane Claiborne, and this is his new book, Rethinking Life. I despised this book. I read this with another friend, and we sort of compared notes on it. And I think that Shane Claiborne comes from a good heart when writing this book and trying to show what a true biblical view of pro-life would look like. Now he's taking that farther. He's taking that idea of being pro-life farther than what we usually deem as pro-life today, farther than the abortion debates, into if we had actually, as Christians, look at life and understand life from a pro-life position, that we value human life, how would that differ? And he has a lot of good things to say in this book, but I think that there is a lot of questions asked without a lot of good answers. His idea of sin in this book is connected with Cain and Abel, and not Adam and Eve, not the fall. He says that is not sin. That sin starts with Cain and Abel, and when Cain takes Abel's life. That sin is the taking of another human being's life, the destruction of another image of God. He takes this idea of sin and narrows it down and ignores everything else, says that it's not sin, and just going against God. So I think that this book can actually be very detrimental to a young Christian in their walk and their understanding of what the Christian life is. Even though Claiborne comes from a good heart, comes from a good place, and asks a lot of very good questions, I think his outcome is just completely off the mark. The final book of these 6 that I was not for me this year is Virginia Woolf's Orlando. I knew this probably wasn't going to be a book for me from the moment that I went into it, and not for the reasons that a lot of people might be thinking. Yes, this book is about a transgender person who goes from being female to male throughout the book. That's not the reason that I didn't enjoy it. The reason I did not enjoy it was that I am not a fan of Virginia Woolf's writing style. Her prose drove me up a wall, which is almost the opposite of what you hear a lot of times with Woolf. A lot of times you hear how influential she is, how amazing her prose is. And I honestly think that it's just because this is the first time that I've ever read Virginia Woolf, the first time I've given her a try. This is a book and an author that I'm going to come back to in the future as I continue to become more read and give her another try. So I look forward to giving her a try, but right now I didn't even finish the book. This is the only book this year that I didn't finish. So that's Virginia Woolf's Orlando. Now for the 6 books that I found to be the most influential on me this year. The ones not that I just enjoyed to read, but that I found actively forming me as a human being and as a person as I read them. The first is St. Augustine's The Trinity. I've read some of St. Augustine before. I've read his Confessions. I've read a lot of what he wrote against Pelagius and the arguments that ensued between those two theologians. I've not read City of God. The Trinity is Augustine's take on trying to fully understand the Trinity within the biblical framework. I think he does better than anybody that I've ever read in doing that. Gives us some good understandings of how we can use our own minds and our own beings in understanding the Trinity. But it's also a book that I had to read in a month. It's probably a book that could take me an entire year. It's over 400 pages of extremely dense theology. And it's a book that I'm going to come back to probably next year and slow read throughout the year. Next is a book that I probably should have read 15 years ago as a teenager. And if you happen to be a teenager out there listening to this, a young adult, heck, if you are just a human being who hasn't read this book, you need to go buy it right now. It's one of the most formative books that I've ever read and will be a yearly read for me, and that is Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Now, Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic philosopher as well as a Roman emperor who wrote down a lot of his thoughts, a lot of his meditations, if you will. His friends and his people gathered those letters and those thoughts together after Aurelius's death and formed this book. Meaning, this is a book that he never knew was going to be published. In fact, he didn't even make a book. These were sort of journal notes, his own thought processes that helped him rule as one of the most influential and greatest Roman emperors of all time. There is more wisdom in this book than almost any other that I've read. It reminded me a lot of the Proverbs as I read through it. Can almost see myself reading the Proverbs and Meditations simultaneously and getting a lot of the same kinds of understandings, the same formations upon the soul. So, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, if you've never read it, get it, take it slow, read a section at a time, ponder it, think about it. It's not a book to just fly through. The point of this book is not to read it. The point of this book is to eat it, to get it within you, to gnaw on it and get the full flavor, get the full meat out of it. Next is Dumas' famous The Count of Monte Cristo. Now, my book's beat up here. This is the Barnes & Noble edition. But I found The Count of Monte Cristo to be one of the most captivating books that I have ever read. Clocking in at an amazing 1,200 pages in this volume, I couldn't put it down. It took me a couple months to get through it, but I was constantly finding myself thinking about this story, thinking about Edmond Dantes and how he has evolved over time to be this man with infinite wealth, infinite power, infinite influence on the world, and yet he is so captivated by his revenge that he's willing to practically give up all of that in order to obtain his one desired goal. It also has one of the best endings that I think I've ever read in a book, where after he finally, spoiler alert, after he finally gets his revenge, what you've been leading up to for 1,000 pages, he obtains it, and he's not sure if it was worth it. That is something that we will constantly be having to ask ourselves as we look into the future and try to bestow pain, suffering, and sorrow upon others. Is it worth it? Will it give me the satisfaction that I'm looking for? He found that he took things too far, accidentally, but these progressions still happened because of the dominoes that he set up. If you've never read Dumas, I would say that this is an amazing place to start. So, The Count of Monte Cristo, give it a shot. Next, I have Silas Marner, The Weaver of Raveloe, by George Eliot. This is one of the best small-town tales that I think I've ever read, and also an amazing look at what it means to live, what it means to be human. Silas Marner is our main character, and he has tragedy befall him at the beginning of the story, and he gives up hope. He gives up hope in people, he gives up hope in God, and decides to just focus all of his time, all of his attention on obtaining money. Eliot sometimes uses this horde-type language that reminds me of a dragon or a goblin who's chasing after money, and the only thing that they ever care about is obtaining this money. You'll see Silas sitting down and counting it over and over and over to make sure that he has what he thinks he has, as well as adding to it what he has obtained since last time he counted. That money gets stolen, and he has lost all purpose to his life. And he loses that gold, and God places, well, George Eliot, but within the story, God places perfectly this little child into his life where he gets to be a father. And the rest of this story is him relearning what it means to be a part of society, to care about people, to love people, and to love God. As far as spiritual formation goes, this is a book worth checking out just purely on that basis. It's not, quote unquote, a Christian book, but it is still an extremely formative book because you're able to see yourself in both sides of Silas, or at least I was. I was able to see myself in the greedy, narcissistic side of Silas who had given up all hope, as well as the side who is trying to become a part of society but not really sure how to do it, not really sure how to interact with people or how to be a father. And yet, he still tries his best and does everything he can because he loves that little girl so much. I've got 2 more books here, both of which influenced me and my thought processes more than anything else I read this year. The first is Hamlet by Shakespeare. Now, I admit that I am not well versed in Shakespeare. I've not read hardly anything from his catalog, and yet I plan to change that after having read this book. I read Hamlet along with a guide to help me understand what's going on. And it's a book that, as soon as I finished it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. There's not that many books that do that to me, that capture my mind in a way that I am continually thinking about it, even now, months after I've read it. I plan to dive deeper into Shakespeare next year, diving into his tragedies, such as Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, King Lear, Macbeth. Those are the ones I'm planning to read, along with Romeo and Juliet, so that I can start to become more versed in Shakespeare, and starting with the tragedies, and then I'll work out from there. But this is a book that I understand now why it has been so influential within Western canon. Why it is considered one of the greatest books or greatest plays ever penned, ever written. Now that I've read it, and I've started to watch more television, started to think more about it, I can notice all the influences that it has had upon the way that we understand literature, the way that we understand ourselves, our movies. There's a reason that they say that Hamlet is an endless book, one that you can read 1,000 times and not get everything out of it, not even touch the surface of what it has to give us. So, Hamlet, Shakespeare, I plan to read it again next year along with all those others after I've read them, come back to Hamlet, and see how I think about it at that point. The last book that has been the most influential book on me this year is our counter to Crime and Punishment, Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. I enjoyed this book so much that I actually read it twice this year. And I plan to read it again next year. Possibly just reading certain sections out of it, and maybe not everything. But this is a book that I have found to be far more influential upon my heart and my soul than anything outside of Scripture. In The Brothers Karamazov, you have the story of three brothers who are representing ideals. Not necessarily human characteristics, but ideals that can be found within the world, ways of living. And you have a patricide, the murder of a father, and the story of these three brothers as they progress after this father's murder, and one of them is convicted. Dostoevsky poured everything he had into this book, and it's obvious to me, it's obvious to tons of people. This is a book that's always at the top list of most influential books ever written. If you want to dip your toes into it, then I would recommend reading the two sections called Rebellion and The Grand Inquisitor. Both of those, back to back, are some of the greatest literature I have ever read in my entire life, and I can read those sections endlessly. As a Christian, they give me pause. They make me think about my beliefs in ways that I often won't. We often encounter the problem of suffering and why a good God would cause or allow suffering in the world. And that's what the book, or the section Rebellion, really focuses on. Ivan, one of these brothers, talking to Alyosha, his other brother, and laying out his case against Christianity. And it's this problem of suffering, the problem of pain, that has really kept him away from it. Why a good God would allow bad things to happen to good, innocent people. And there are some sections within that rebellion that, when I think back to now, they make me shudder. They make me really have to dive deep and think about these kinds of things, because his remarks are not things that we can just push to the side, push away. They are things that we deal with every single day of our life. In the section on the Grand Inquisitor, Ivan lays out everything that he thinks that Jesus has done wrong. He does it through the eyes of the Grand Inquisitor, this person who Jesus comes back to Earth to visit his people and gets captured by the Roman Church. They don't want to give up their power. And so the Grand Inquisitor sort of lets Jesus know that they're in charge now, not him. He got it wrong. They're doing it right. And Ivan uses logic and reasoning to point out all the things that Jesus did wrong. And at the end, his brother, Alyosha, the Christian, answers the Grand Inquisitor with a kiss. It's probably the most important kiss in all of literature, because that kiss alone shows the ideals of Christianity. Reason and logic can't explain God. They can't explain everything that he does. And yet that kiss shows us that there is a higher ideal than logic and reasoning. The ideal of love. And as a Christian, that's the ideal that we need to live in, that we want to strive for. We don't want to reason our way into Christianity. We can't reason our way into Christianity. But we can love our way into Christianity. Love our way into the hearts of other people. Those two books, or those two sections within the Brothers Karamazov, if you want to dip your toes in, that's the place to start. Outside of that, if you have any recommendations for me this year, then leave a comment below. Go ahead and hit the like button on this so that other people can see it. And if you're interested in hearing more about the Spiritual Formation Book Club, or follow along as I can read books and give sort of synopses and reviews about them from a Christian perspective, as well as the things that we can glean from them spiritually, then go ahead and subscribe. And I look forward to a great 2024, and I hope you'll join me.